Hello, this is Otaku Solutions. Before we dive into fast ref, there's something unexpected we need to address first. For Maya-based studios, this isn't an issue. But for studios that started with 3ds Max or Blender from the very beginning, based on my experience, they often lack a proper file structure. To use a reference system, you must establish a master rigging folder. Usually you'd separate the master and animation folders. But without strict rules, rigging files and animation files easily get mixed up. And in reality, this happens surprisingly often. Out of 10 companies, about 6 had everything completely mixed together. Of course, I might have just happened to work at those specific places. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but studios without a dedicated rigger are highly prone to this. Without a rigging department, they often manage everything directly inside a single animation folder. What I want to emphasize is that once you adopt fast ref, you need to separate these folders for a smooth workflow. Let me explain why this concept is so crucial. In your project, you'll generally have two types of animation-related files: the original rigging file and the animation scene file. The original rig contains the skeleton, controllers, and skinning data. And it should never contain any animation keys. People often save test animation data directly inside the rig file. Instead, back those up as separate .bip or animation files. For stability, keep the original rigging file completely clean with no animation data inside. So that's the rigging file. The animation file is what you normally work on day to day. With fast ref, you should always load the rig as a reference link, rather than working directly inside the rig file. Never merge the rig directly or open the rigging file and save it under a different name to start animating. That is a major anti-pattern. Always load it as a reference link through fast ref before you begin animating. I highly recommend this approach. In many studios, you might see a folder structure like this: rig files, animation files, old versions, and duplicate rig files, all sitting in the same directory. This is very common, but you should avoid keeping them all in the same place. Personally, I always divide them into two main folders: a rigging folder and an animation folder. I even separate the animation work in progress runs. Always keep the master rigging file in the rigging folder, and put old backups in a separate directory. My typical setup has the master rigging file, texture files, and an old folder for backups. It's best to keep textures in the same folder as the rig so it can load them using relative paths. And we use the old folder to store previous backups. The ref folder can be used for character concept art or design references. That's how I organize the ref folder. I highly recommend setting up this structure for each character. Now, let's get back to the main topic. Let's continue our explanation. Which file is actually the latest version? 1. Download to local C drive and edit. 2. Copy and rename the max file. 3. Upload it. 4. Files duplicate endlessly. 5. Start a vote on Messenger. I wrote this to show what happens in the field when things aren't organized. This is a very common scenario. Where is the rigging file? I think it's in this folder. Even the person in charge isn't sure. Oh wait, that was just a test file. Check the approved folder. Where is the approved folder? Things get tangled up like this. So if you have a rigging folder, it must contain only the designated rigging files. You have to make that rule. Otherwise, people won't be able to find the files, and that happens all the time in production. There are also too many duplicate files. A file for character A would be in the cinematic folder, the animation folder, and the rigging folder. The exact same file duplicated in 3 different places. You should never do this. You must establish a centralized master folder. My phrasing here might be a bit strong, but let me give you another real-world example. At a Blender-based studio I worked with, I asked the Rigor where the rigging file for character A was located. They sent me a file, and while it was indeed the correct character, the rig file actually had the character's ultimate skill animation still baked into it with animation data intact. I was quite taken aback and wondered what to do. I asked, where is the clean original rig fileline T pose or A pose, without any animation data? Looking into the history, the animator in charge had simply overwritten the master rigging file with their working animation file. Since I was new to the team, I had to manually delete all animation data and restore it back to the default A pose. This is exactly why you must never mix them. Rigging files should only contain rig data, never animation keys. Keep them completely separate. Rigging files should contain only rig data, nothing else. Because of my experience, I can spot these issues right away. I always have a confirmation process when checking data. Like toggling skinning modifiers on and off as a quick sanity check. I also check for leftover junk nodes or stray data. I'm glad my experience lets me catch these things. But if someone without that experience simply gets told to export this as a skeletal mesh for the engine. Importing a rig with an active animation pose baked into it will completely break the default bind pose in the engine. Yes, the initial bind pose. As far as I know, Unreal Engine has a feature to set the bind pose starting at frame 0. But if frame 0 itself is already broken, the skeletal mesh imports with that corrupted data baked in. And once the base mesh is corrupted, all animations applied to it in the engine will break as well. Well, thinking about it more with a well-structured setup, it might not always break. But I still strongly recommend following these guidelines. Always make sure the clean default pose is properly registered when setting up in the engine. You never know what kind of accident might happen down the line. These issues are more common than you'd think. About 6 out of 10 studios had the master folder and rigging files mixed in with animation files. Even major studios often struggled with this. Surprisingly, even major companies. Why? Because they lacked dedicated riggers or animation teams who understood the importance of this. Tush were present, but in Korea, most Tush tend to be materials or shader focused rather than animation pipeline focused. With the animation TA and rigging mindset being less common, the importance of proper folder structure often goes unnoticed. And if there's only one generalist TA handling everything, they simply can't manage all of it. That's why both animators and riggers need to be aware of this themselves. Even junior riggers may not fully understand this concept yet. So we must centralize everything into a master rigging folder. And never save any animation data inside it. Instead, always load it as a reference link using FastRef. That link is the connection point. This is how you centralize your pipeline. To reiterate, never put animation keys in the rigging folder. This folder should only be managed by the dedicated rigger or the animation lead. Ideally, regular animators should not touch this folder at all. Animators should have their own separate animation folder. Load the rig as a reference link first. Then work exclusively inside that animation folder. Let me give you an example. Most of you probably work on a NAS or shared network drive. Let's walk through a typical folder setup. Your project root folder might look something like Project Super, with pre-production and main production folders inside. Let's call the main folder 3D. Animators work in the main 3D folder, inside a numbered animation subfolder. Set up the folder this way, and animators can work on scenes like Scene A 1-inch inside their designated folder. And riggers would organize their files as something like ch1 rig. The riggers set up and maintain the rigging folder, and animators manage their scene files per character. The key point is that animators should work exclusively within their designated animation folder. Riggers should only work within the rigging folder. They can read the animation folder, but overwriting anything in it should be strictly avoided. Similarly, animators may open the rig folder to check which version they're working with, but they should never overwrite anything in it. That's my example. Now let's get back on track. To reiterate, never open a 3ds Max rigging file and simply save as to start animating. Always use FastRef to add it as a reference link. Then work within that linked relationship. If you're working alone, this might not seem critical. But with a team of 35 to 40 artists, which is typical for a 100-person project, strict rules become essential. That's roughly 35 to 40 people. When 40 people are all working simultaneously, having agreed upon rules and working within them is the only way to prevent confusion. Internally, establishing these folder rules and making it clear which folders must never be touched is strongly recommended. Thank you for following along so far. The master folder concept is truly critical. This isn't just my personal preference, it's a global industry standard. Most professional studios around the world work this way. Interestingly, most people do organize their game engine folders quite carefully. But surprisingly, the same discipline is often neglected inside DCC tools like 3ds Max. You need to apply that same rigor to your DCC file structure too. I personally call this kind of tangled mess chaos. And nothing good ever comes out of chaos. Of course, some level of messiness is inevitable. Perfection is impossible. But at a minimum, I personally aim to keep the chaos ratio in my pipeline below 7%. And the person in charge must actively correct things when they start to get tangled. In most cases, that person is the team lead. Leads must step in and correct this. Since junior staff are often afraid to touch things, the lead must take ownership of the team's pipeline. And clearly define the folder structure across all departments. That concludes our overview of basic 3D pipeline folder structure and references. This has been Otaku Solutions. Thank you.